So we have to pass this back and forth, just so you know, we're doing that.
Right.
Hold it.
I gotta hold this thing. I'm just gonna badger him with questions. Maurice is a member of the Yavapai Apache Nation. He is from around here. He graduated from Mingus High School in 1996, played soccer for Coach Badger, ran cross country for Coach O'Donnell, and enjoyed Chip Curry's history classes. So he's home. Yeah, some of these folks here.
Yeah. Curry's here, yeah. Grayer than I remember, but he's here.
He earned his PhD in history from the University of New Mexico in 2015 and is currently assistant professor of Native American Studies at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. He teaches a variety of courses of Native American history and researches and writes about the history of the indigenous people of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. And I'll just mention, I met him when we were both research fellows at the Clements Center for Southwest Studies at Southern Methodist University a couple of years ago. Discovered what a fantastic scholar he was. And you know, as a white dude who grew up in Phoenix, to the Colossus to the south, I like to think I taught him everything he knows about Native American history. Pretty sure that's not true. That's a joke, of course. But as scholars, we've both written about the Yaqui and Tohono in particular, and we've benefited a great deal by becoming colleagues and friends, serving on conference panels together, reading each other's work, and even traveling about a year and a half ago down to Sonora, to the Rio Yaqui, to spend some time there in July. I don't advise July. You might wait for a different time of year, but it was a fantastic trip, and I really do feel quite honored to have been invited to facilitate the discussion today. And I think he wanted to say a few words.
What's your name?
That's my job. We're introducing each other, so.
It's kind of weird, I know.
I came up with this weird idea. Like Eric said, we did go to Mexico together a couple summers ago, and it was not your typical, you know, Rocky Point, Mexico trip. It was more to the indigenous villages along the Rio Yaqui there, and probably the most memorable part, well, two most memorable parts were our Yaqui guide almost died on the mountain he took us to. Literally, I had to go up there and guide him back down his own mountain. And then we got stuck in mud right by the sea. It looked like it was dry, and then the minivan we were in was just, and we had nothing to pull it out with. We were shoving empty water bottles under the wheels and pulling weeds and putting them in there, so it was a memorable trip.
I do want to point out, that was after both of us said to our guide, who almost died on the mountain,
Yeah.
maybe you shouldn't drive down there.
It was the blind leading the blind classic. Okay, so I'm going to introduce my friend. This is Eric Meeks, who is an associate professor at Northern Arizona University, just a few miles up the hill. His research and teaching focus primarily on the history of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, so we share that in common, race and ethnicity in North America. His first book, which is called Border Citizens, The Making of Indians, Mexicans, and Anglos in Arizona, which is a book I read as a graduate student that was very influential, and I remember thinking who this Eric Meeks is, and that was before we met. It's now going to be in its second edition, out this month, right?
Yes.
So if anyone is interested in kind of the making of ethnic identity in that region of southern Arizona, northern Mexico, then I highly recommend that book. And the new edition has an afterword that discusses Arizona's aggressive response to undocumented immigration, which is, you know, a very contemporary issue, and the ethnic studies programs dispute in the decades since the book was originally published, and just kind of demonstrating that the broad-based movement against these measures had ramifications that reverberated outside of Arizona, well beyond Arizona. He also looks at and has revisited several times Yaqui and Tohono nations on both sides of the border. If you're familiar, the U.S.-Mexico border crosses through traditional indigenous homeland and splits tribal nations apart. And he looks at ways that those tribes have sought to retain control of those lands and keep those connections between both sides on the Mexico and U.S. Side in the face of continued and ramped up enforcement. He's currently working on a new book on the history of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands from the late 18th century to the present, so it's a very short time span.
Shorter than yours.
It is shorter than mine. It's actually longer than my book. With Yale University Press, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be with Yale Press. So Eric, me, we're going to have this dialogue between each other. I asked him to come and sort of pose some questions. I thought it would be a little more interesting than me standing up and just talking for an hour. And we also encourage participation, so there will be an opportunity for people to contribute and ask questions. Some of you may have read the book, probably most of you not. I've gotten a few comments from family members. My mom, bless her heart, she said, I'm reading your book, and yeah, that is not light reading, is it? No, it's not toilet reading, it's not a coffee table book. Although it does have some good pictures. There's a handful of good pictures in there. And then Jim this morning, I can embarrass you, right? Yeah. He kind of said the same. He's just like, I haven't had the time to really get into it, because when I read it, it's just kind of like, which is okay. It's an academic book. It's published with an academic press, so it's likely not a book that you'll see at Costco, although I wish that it could be at a place like that, because it would fly off and I'd make a lot of money. But I'm not going to make any money with this book. Hopefully it'll get me tenure in my work, but aside from that, that's kind of where it's at. So yeah. I'll let you start with a question.
Yeah, Maurice said that my new work is going to cover a long time span, but this book goes from 1598 to 1912. What is that, 320 years, something like that? It's a very long time. And looks at the history of what he calls indigenous electorates. So it's kind of a history of indigenous politics among particular groups. The Pueblos along the northern Rio Grande and its tributaries, the Hopis in northern Arizona, the Tonaotum in the Arizona-Sonora borderlands, and the Yaquis from southwestern Sonora, but who also have had a presence in Arizona now for at least 150 years. So very ambitious, very broad in scope. And of course, he's a member of the Yavapai Apache Nation. And one of my first questions for him was, what drew you to this particular topic? Why were you interested in tracing the history, particularly this idea of indigenous electorates? And that might be a good place to start.
Okay, so the book was born out of family interest. Probably have a lot of Camp Verde natives here who knew my grandpa, Ned Russell, and as a master's student in graduate school, I did a master's thesis was a biography of his life. And so we sat down over the course of a week and did a bunch of interviews and recorded those. And he told me all about his experiences growing up in Verde Valley and Clarkdale and Middle Verde and kind of and beyond. And it spanned his whole life, but I was sort of drawn to specific episodes, particularly the parts of his early life in the Verde Valley. And so one story that he told me was in Clarkdale on Main Street, there's this row of buildings, and at the bottom end, as you're approaching, starting to go down the hill, there used to be a general store there, and it was like was it a Woolrich or something like that? I don't know what it was, but it was a general store. And as a kid, so he had gone to boarding school as a youngster. So when the federal government took Native American children and sent them away to boarding schools, he went to one of those schools, which is a whole other episode of his life. And it was a policy of cultural genocide. I mean, it was a way to make Native American children not speak their languages anymore, and they chopped their hair short and were very physically abusive. It was a very authoritarian environment, but at a certain point, his dad, Henry Russell, brought the kids back, and they were young teenagers, and he went to the old Clarkdale Middle School there that's kind of towards Patio Town and said, my kids are going to this school. They're not going to boarding school anymore. So enroll them in public school. And the people at the school said, okay, we'll do that. So they lived. So he lived there after going away to boarding school, where you'd be all year and sometimes all summer too. Sometimes you wouldn't come home during the summer because you'd have a job where they'd kind of farm you out for labor. So he was there in town, and he had kind of a group of friends, and Ned would have been the first to tell you that he was a sort of a hellraiser, got into trouble and was kind of headstrong, and just, he had that kind of personality. And they figured out a way to break into the store on Main Street in Clarkdale.
Selmas.
And what's that?
Selmas.
Selmas, is that what it was called?
Yeah.
Okay, Selmas. Selmas, all right. And it involved climbing up on the canvas awning that hung over the doorway in the back. That some of the stores in that alley still have that kind of thing, it hangs over. They kind of propelled themselves up onto that, and then they could reach onto the roof. And then they got up onto the roof, and when you went in there was a hatch, and you pulled it open, and you looked in, and they just looked right into the store. And for these boys, and they lived on the Clarkdale Reservation, which wasn't a reservation at the time. They were poor, dirt poor, didn't have any money or any nice things, and so they see this store that's kind of open season for them. And so they lowered themselves in and helped themselves to whatever they could find. And Ned remembered specifically taking a pair of Levi's, like some overalls and a new wallet and some boots, and they took candy and whatever these 12, 13-year-olds would be interested. And then got out of the store. And they didn't get caught doing it. What happened was he was walking somewhere in town, because the reservation and the non-reservation communities are just right next to each other, and people went to the same places and kind of knew each other. And the sheriff or whoever it was, law enforcement, saw him with gleaming boots and brand new jeans, and he said, I know who your family is. I know who your dad is. I know where you live. And I know that you can't afford those things. So he said, where did you get your stuff? And of course, Ned, and I don't know what his response was, but he was guilty by his appearance. I mean, it was clear that he had stolen those things. And so it came out that he had stolen. So he was sent to Fort Grant, where there was a juvenile detention place for the summer. And what he told me was he spent 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days. That was his sentence. So it was a 333. And it was kind of over the summertime, so he could hide the fact that he went to the juvie for the summer and could save some of the embarrassment. And then he went back home, and it was kind of like, oh, what'd you do over the summer? And, oh, we went on a vacation. I went on a vacation for 3 months. Well, whatever. But the effect of that was that it sort of branded him a troublemaker. And so from that point, if there was a break-in or a theft or whatever it might be, he would be fingered right away. And so the second time he was accused of something, and it was another theft or something like that, which he told me, he swore that he wasn't guilty, he hadn't done it. He got into trouble, and they did antics and whatnot that teenagers do. But this he hadn't done, he insisted. Nevertheless, because he had been in trouble before, they sent him again to Fort Grant, and this time for a year. Except they gave him an option. When he got there, they said, you can stay in the juvenile boys' home, the old boys' ranch, or you can be essentially indentured to a family for a year. And he was given the option to live with this ranching family, a white ranching family down there in southern Arizona, and stay with them for a year and work on their ranch. I mean, the only similarity, the only thing you could compare it to is like indentured servitude. I mean, that's what it was. He wasn't a slave, but he was arrested. He was within the system, and so he was farmed out to a family on a farm and worked on this dry ranching thing, and it was hard work. And they did some irrigation, but it was mostly dry farming, and they worked hard. But he said the family treated him well, and they'd go into town on the weekends and go to the movies, and He attended school there as well and played football. He said that it was like 6-man football because they didn't have enough people on those schools. So it was like, it was like Parker and these tiny communities, and so he played football. And when it was done, he went back home. But he said overall it wasn't a bad experience. But what he said this is how it relates to the book. I'm kind of circling back around. This is a long way of telling. Both times he was taken by the authorities and basically sentenced. It wasn't a trial, there were no witnesses, there was no due process. It was basically, he was an Indian and he was guilty, and so he was, we have to sit up. Are we getting the signals?
I think standing up might be beneficial.
Stand up,
for those
okay.
of us in the cheap seats.
Okay. We can do that, yeah. So let me finish my story and then we'll stand up. So, like I was saying, in both cases, there was no due process. And mind you, this is after 1924, because Ned was born in 1924. 1924 is the year that the Congress passed a federal Indian Citizenship Act. So Native people in the United States were all birthright citizens after 1924, which meant you should have been entitled to a trial, and even a juvenile court. You should have been entitled to some sort of due process, but he wasn't. And in both of those cases, he was just sent away. And there was sentencing, basically, without any real legal procedure. And so that got me thinking about, okay, so looking at a early 20th century and the previous era in a place like Arizona and New Mexico, which have large Native American populations comparatively. New Mexico and Arizona have some of the largest in the country. What actual civil rights did Native Americans have before that time? And the common narrative is that, well, in Arizona and New Mexico, both states in 1948 is when there were 2 court cases that won, I put that in quotes, won the right to vote for Native Americans. A case involving a Yavapai at Fort McDowell in Arizona, a guy by the name of Frank Harrison, who tried to register to vote and was turned away, and so he sued the county registrar in Maricopa County, and it went to the Arizona Supreme Court, and they overturned an older policy that banned Native Americans from voting due to a clause in the state constitution that referred to wardship, that Native people were wards and therefore couldn't vote. But the wardship clause in the actual Constitution referred to institutionalized and mentally insane people, and so Native Americans were classed as the same class as institutionalized people. And then in New Mexico, it had to do with taxation. They barred Native people because under the New Mexico Constitution, it said Indians not taxed can't vote, and it was specifically referring to a property tax for Native peoples. They said you don't pay property tax on a reservation, even though you pay every other tax. You pay a sales tax, or you pay a tax on a car if you go to register. And the court in New Mexico said if a white person didn't own a house and didn't pay a property tax, would they be barred from voting? The answer was absolutely not. So it has to be racially based, which is a constitutional violation. So the narrative would seem like, oh, Native people over time, it's this progressive 1948, finally there's court cases that win the right to vote. It's sort of a civil rights narrative that has a neat, tidy ending, a happy ending. Oh, after that, everything's great. But as I got into the research of the book and looking at specifically at voting, enfranchisement, political participation in systems of governance, what I found is that Native Americans were voting long before 1948 and 1912 and 1924. That there's a long history of Native peoples being involved in political processes, being involved in government, being involved in voting. But we just have to look at it a little more creatively and understand that it's not always going to the ballot box and putting in a ballot or raising your hand at a town meeting, that voting takes other forms and enfranchisement takes other forms. And that Native Americans, historically, from the first period of Spanish colonization to the early 20th century, are doing this, but they're just doing it in different ways, and we have to kind of reimagine how we think about voting. And so that was the inspiration for the book, but it came from family experience, really. It came from a lack of civil rights in my own family, and then being interested in that. Okay, now we can stand up, I suppose.
I will talk very loud. I'm not going to really say that much. I'm just going to ask him questions. And then I'm going to let you guys ask him questions. So I do want this to become a discussion.
Great.
Normally as scholars, if students are in my class, I would tell them or ask them, what is the thesis of this book, right? What's the main argument? I'm not going to ask it in quite the same way of you. What I want to ask you is, what do you think is the most important thing that you're hoping to get across with this book?
Okay. It's a good question.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer.
Okay.
Let's go home. I think the most important point that I'm trying to make with this book, and by the way, I could fit 3 copies in my suitcase traveling here, so if anyone wants to buy a copy, I have 3 for sale. I'll give them at a discounted price. It's great bathroom reading. You ask my mom. So the main point that I'm trying to make is this. If we think that Native Americans and ethnic minorities in general only participate in things like voting and government after like congressional acts or court decisions grant rights, that we're thinking about it in the wrong way. It's not all about kind of civil rights era decisions. And so let me give you an example. When Spain comes to this region of the United States and northern Mexico, when Spain comes to the southwest beginning in the 1500s, and for New Mexico, it's 1598 is when Oñate leads a group that goes to New Mexico to found a permanent colony and plant Spaniards there and subdue Pueblo peoples, which is one of the groups I look at. They don't want to deal with a large group of indigenous leaders, which is traditional. And in a village, there's usually not just one person in charge. Even the idea, our idea of like a chief, there's a chief of a village. That's not how it works. There's a council of elders who would counsel about village decisions, and they would sometimes talk all night until they reach an agreement. Well, when Spaniards come, they see that form and they're greeted by these large groups of traditional elders, and they're like, okay, who has power here? We all do. No, we don't want that. We want one person. We want one guy that we can point to, and always a guy, not a woman. And they don't understand that either, that in our matrilineal societies, like Apache society and Yavapai society as well, it's matriarchal, matrilineal, matrilocal. Spaniards they have no conception of that. They want one dude that they can point to. And so in New Mexico after 1598, they go to these villages of Pueblo peoples and they say, enough with your councils of elders, we want one person, and it's going to be a governor. And that was the Spanish term, a gobernador, except in an Indian Pueblo, they often called it a gobernadorcillo, which is like a little governor, because they were sort of diminishing the importance of that person. They said, we want you to have a governor every year, and we want you to elect that governor the same way that we do in our towns in Spain, and in New Spain now, because they've been there for a while. They said, we want you to have an annual election, and want you to vote this person into power, and then once they come to power, we want them to hold a cane with a silver tip that has a cross on it, so that we know when we're looking around, where's the governor? Oh, it's that guy, because he's got a cane in his hand. And then he's going to have a lieutenant governor, who's his right-hand man. And then there are going to be other officers, like a sheriff and a ditch captain, and all these people. And the lesser officers are going to get shorter canes that are about this long. And they only wield these. So, and that cane becomes an important symbol. It's called a vara de justicia, or it's like a cane. A vara is a length that's almost like a yard. So a vara de justicia is a cane of justice, or a cane of power. And again, they say, we want you to elect these officers on an annual basis. You think 4-year turnover is bad, or 2-year turnover, 3-year turnover? Imagine electing a completely new group of leaders every single year. And so this ostensibly should bring indigenous communities into a form of democracy, right? If they're forced to do so by Spaniards, which they were, Spaniards were not kind when they go there, they don't say.
we'd really like it if you elect governors every day. You will do this. This is colonial mandate. But the catch is this. Native people, when the tire hits the ground, they do it their own way. They say, okay, we'll do it, but we're gonna do it in our own way. That is a mixture of indigenous practice and then on the surface looks like a Spanish town government, like you wanted us to. And so, for example, at the Pueblos in New Mexico, what they do is most Pueblos have a dual government. So they'll have summer people and winter people. And there was a summer chief and a winter chief. And at the election time was always around New Year, around January 1st. At the end of the year, the summer and the winter chief get together and they alternate years. And one of them will say to the other, hey, it's time for our elections again. And they say, oh, it's summer chief's turn this year. And so summer chief says, I think this guy should be governor. And he just says a name. And then the winter chief says, good idea. I think this guy should be lieutenant governor. And they go back and forth until they've named the entire officer corps. And they might disagree. They might say, no, I don't like that guy. I know a little bit about him and his family. I heard the gossip and he's not a good candidate. Oh, okay, let's change it. But eventually they get to a point where there's agreement. Then they go to the traditional council of elders, which is clan leaders, society heads of different religious societies within the community. And they say, it's time for our election. Here's who we decided on. And the town leaders look at the list and they say, oh, yeah, these are good names. And generally there's agreement because in indigenous societies, things are done by consensus and people agree. Typically, if they don't agree, then maybe there could be some objection to somebody that's on the list. And somebody might say, well, I know that guy and he's not fit for office or whatever it might be. But at the end, they agree on it. At that point, election's over. That's the election. So you see, what Spain envisioned and what indigenous people actually do are two different things, and they're sort of subverting colonial mandates and doing it in their own way, but in a clever way that still maintains traditional practices of ruling by consensus, choosing. And then what's funny is, after they've done this deliberating and they've kind of come up with their candidates and decided and approved, they have to let the new people know. And in a Pueblo in New Mexico, for example, if you become a governor or an officer, it's a year office. You don't get paid for it. And on top of that, you're not really asked to serve, or you're told. And so as they're having these meetings, it's just before January 1st, there's very special care given to not letting the potential officers know. Don't let the cat out of the bag, because they might leave town and not be there. And I worked with a guy who was an officer at Cochiti Pueblo. He was the sheriff for the year. And it was without pay. He had to keep his job in Albuquerque where we worked together, but then he would drive 40 minutes from Cochiti to Albuquerque and 40 minutes back. His shift as the sheriff, the legal officer of the Pueblo, started when he finished work and went back home. And he was there all night, and then he'd go back to work in the morning. So he basically didn't sleep for a year. And I'd come up on him and during work, and he'd be asleep. And he was the maintenance manager at this museum I worked at. And he said, man, that was a hard year when it was over. And it was a time had lapsed, and he said, I have this feeling that I'm going to be elected again. And I said, oh, what are you going to do? And he said, this Christmas I'm going on a cruise. Because then they won't be able to put me in office. Still, what's funny is that there are historical cases of that, and even recently, where somebody did skip town, and they sent people to find that person and brought him back. So I knew another guy who was from Acoma Pueblo, which is, if anyone has been there, it's up on the mesa, it's this famous place, and one of his relatives was going to be lieutenant governor, I believe. And he had gone to Las Cruces during the holidays, which is southern New Mexico, but it's a good distance away, it's like a 6-hour drive. When he was chosen, he wasn't around, so they put somebody in a car and said, we know where he is, go get him and bring him back, which they did. They drove down there, put him in the car, and drove him back. So once that election has happened, they go through this other process, and whereby the Catholic priest in the community does a special mass for the new officers. The traditional leaders have already told these new people that they're the new governors and given them traditional blessings, so they have a dual sanction, which comes from Catholic God and Indigenous religious ceremonies, and so they have this what's called a dual sanction. And then after that's done, they travel to Santa Fe, which is the provincial seat in colonial New Mexico, where the governor of New Mexico basically inaugurates them and reads them a speech where he says, "You're the officers from your communities. Be good examples for your people. Serve them well, and we'll have a good year," basically, and they send them back. The reason that that's important is because in these communities, which are they're basically they're religious communities. They're government. There's traditionally in Pueblo communities no separation of church and state. The leadership in the communities are religious in nature, and so it's not like one is a secular leader and one is a religious leader. They're the same thing. But once Spain came, the officers in the town government became purely secular officers. And they handled all of the affairs with the outside world. So they were the ones, if there was a land dispute with Hispano communities nearby, they would be the ones going to Santa Fe and to the court and to the governor and logging a formal complaint and trying to get outsiders expelled from their land, or if there was a dispute over water, or if there was a crime committed. They were sort of the front that confronted the colonial state of Spain. And so what you have here is an example of Indigenous people taking a colonial mandate that dealt specifically with voting and with governance on a town level, changing it, subverting it, sort of in a clever way, making it their own and indigenizing it. And because it worked, Spain sort of turned a blind eye. And they said, whatever, that's fine. And it got to the point where if Spaniards were meddling in those elections on an annual level, there we go, our lights out, there we go. If Spaniards were meddling in those elections and trying to get certain people put in office, that Pueblo peoples would go to the governor or even all the way to the viceroy in Mexico City and make a complaint. And sometimes royal mandates would come back and say, you can't do that. To Spaniards, you can't meddle in Pueblo elections. This is how they do it, and this is their right to do it. And sometimes officers who had been removed were reinstated. And so the system that is put in place in the Pueblos of New Mexico is so kind of deeply part of those communities that it's still in place today. If you go to those communities today, the secular leader of those communities is a governor. Go to any of the Pueblos sites and look about them, type in about government, and you'll find the names of the governor, the lieutenant governor, the sheriff, the other officers. Hold on just a second. And most of them still do it in the traditional way. Some of them have instituted actual elections where they have popular votes, but that's more of a 20th century phenomenon. Traditionally, they still elect leadership in the Indian way, which is not what we would think of as an election, right? I mean, if you were just told you were going to be the officer, Jim, you're the town mayor for Clarkdale. You'd probably run out of town as well, right? But that's the way it was done. And what I like is Charles Lummis, who was this sort of famous author and Indian rights advocate in the early 1900s, late 1800s. He lived for a time at Isleta Pueblo with the governor of the Pueblo's family. And he said, there's no campaigning for office. The leaders serve without pay. He said, truly it is the one place where the office seeks the man. And that's kind of how it's done there. So using that as an example, it extends to the other groups that I studied. They have a similar form, although it differs according to the specific context. Hopis had that form of governance for a time until they booted the Spaniards out permanently. In 1700, they destroyed the village of Awadabi, kicked the Spanish presence out of Hopi, and so that system doesn't remain to the present. But in Tohono O'odhams, there was that form of government into the latter part of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And some of the titles have been retained. So among, for example, Salt River, Gila River, you still have a governor in some of those communities. Why governor? That comes from Spanish tradition of having a gobernador in those communities. And then Yaquis as well had that same electoral system. So the main argument that I'm making is Indigenous people are enfranchised since the 1500s. They're just enfranchised in a different way. And we have to broaden what we think qualifies as voting to include different forms of governance. And this would be one, and then it changes over time and according to which colonial state is in power. So Mexico is briefly the power of this region from 1821 to 1846. They respect that same Spanish system, but then when the United States comes in the 19th century, and they say, what is this? We don't. This doesn't make sense to us. And so they try to make citizens out of Indians, and there's pushback from Native peoples who say, we don't want to be U.S. citizens. The Americans think, well, we're bestowing these great rights on you, and they're like, we already have rights. We've already done this. We've already gone through this. We don't want to do this again. And so the main overall point is Native people are enfranchised historically and accept or reject citizenship rights according to the historical moment and according to what serves their community best. And historically, there's more examples of them saying, no, thank you, than actually saying, yes, we want what you have to offer. It's really not until the 20th century that you have Native people going to court and saying, we want to be American citizens. Before that, it's, no thanks. We'll do what you said. We'll have this form of government in our towns, but beyond that, we're not interested. So it's a long, rambling answer to your question. Yeah.
I can see I'm not going to have to ask a whole lot of questions. Easy gig, man. Easy gig. So this is interesting because, traditionally the way Native American history was told in this country, at least up to the 1960s, it was there wasn't a lot of good Native American history, frankly. It was stories of colonial expansion, of westward expansion, and the movement into the West was thought of in these romantic terms as sort of a positive good.
Manifest destiny.
Manifest destiny, all of that, sort of essential to American identity. 70s, we start to see revisions of that. And there's a big swing, right? We see Indigenous scholars in particular who are writing a very different story. Custer, died for your sins. An activist historiography in which Indigenous people are talking about oppression and genocide, right? I mean, the Spaniards, when they came into Mesoamerica, by the way, literally means Middle America. It's not the Middle America some of you are probably thinking about. It's Central Mexico, okay? Not Kansas. Anyway, in about 100 years, the population of Mesoamerica drops, estimated from about 25 million people to 1 million people, right, under New Spain. For a lot of reasons. A lot of it's outright violence, it's warfare, it's forced labor, enslavement, disease. You can't really separate these things because disease, of course, is connected to all of these other abuses. So the story became about oppression. Now you're telling a story that's maybe a little befuddling, right? Which is Spaniards bring this system. They give canes of office to Indigenous people. They don't just give them to them. They basically foist them on them, right? They force them to accept this system of government.
Yeah.
And then history happens. 350 years of history happens. And Spain changes. The system of Spanish colonial government changes. There's reforms in the late colonial period that want to take some of those old systems to remove the missions, to remove the right to communal land holdings, right? And then Mexico becomes independent, and they want to push that even further. And then, as you just pointed out, the United States comes along and says, we don't recognize any of this, right? You're telling a story in which seemingly a colonial imposition over time becomes a means of resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Could you comment on that?
Sure.
Yeah.
One story that I like to share, which is, I think this might be out. Are my batteries dead? It is.
You talk too long, man.
Well, it was going to be on for an hour and a half anyway. I don't know whether I talked or not. Okay, so I'm going to have to talk loud.
there's an apocryphal story that is commonly told. You might have heard about where the term Canada comes from. Has anyone heard this? So the story goes like this. Native people encounter Spaniards. Spain is everywhere. We tend to think that Great Britain colonizes North America. That's not true. Spain does a lot more colonizing than Great Britain or France. Spain is in Virginia, on the coast from Florida up the coast, the Atlantic coast, all the way to Virginia. So the story goes that Native people encountering Spaniards learn enough to say, when they approach their villages, acá, here, nada. Meaning, here there's nothing, keep going. Because what are Spaniards after? They're after material wealth, whether it's mining, gold, mineral wealth, people for labor, people that they can put into mission communities that will then be tribute people who pay tribute to the Spanish crown. So it's not a true story. That's not where Canada comes from. But the idea is Native people learn enough to say, acá, nada, meaning, leave us alone. Go to the next place. And so this system of town democracy becomes a way of saying to colonizers, leave us alone and go to the next place. And the perfect example of that is in 1680, Pueblo people in New Mexico, and also Hopis are involved, they kick the Spaniards out of the province. There's a violent revolt in 1680. They send out runners with cords that have knots signifying, we're all going to revolt on the same day, untie a knot for each day, and when you reach the last knot, that's the day when we all revolt together. And it's discovered actually 2 days before it's supposed to happen. And so they send runners out again and they say, well, they think they found us out and we're not going to do it, so let's just revolt 2 days early instead. And so they do it the very next day, and it's completely successful. I mean, they boot Spaniards out of New Mexico completely. They besiege the capital at Santa Fe, and the governor and the other survivors are there, kind of held up in the palace of the governors and eventually forced to leave. And Native people sort of menacingly accompany them the entire way down to El Paso. So that's where the city of El Paso comes from. It's El Paso del Norte, and it becomes the place where the refugees from New Mexico go. So for 12 years, there's no Spaniards in New Mexico. There's no Spanish colonial rule. Pueblo communities sort of, the stories are that they go to the rivers that are considered sacred, and they wash off their baptisms, their Spanish baptisms. They change their names back, no more Spanish names, and go back to a traditional way of life. But it didn't last. What happens is Spain reconquers New Mexico in 1692. So 12 years later, they come back. And the reason that I'm telling this story is because there's this episode where Diego de Vargas, who is the Reconquista leader of New Mexico, the reconqueror, he goes to these communities, and he was a prolific writer. So his journals, you can read the Vargas journals, and they tell all of this history and his encounters with Native people. So he goes to one Native village after another to sort of resubmit them to the two kings, the Catholic king and Christ, the King of Heaven. And they would go through this ceremony, and there'd be a priest with him, and they'd have to kiss the ring, kind of put themselves into submission once again to Spanish colonial authority. But when he goes to these villages, he encounters groups of indigenous people in those communities who come out, and what do? They have canes in their hands, and they say, we already chose our officers for the year. We don't need to do this. Basically saying, this is what you're going to want us to do, right? So we're doing it good, leave us alone, go away. And it sort of works in that sense, although there's continued violence, and the Reconquista is not a bloodless reconquest. It's quite violent, and there are more revolts. But it's interesting that Pueblo communities say, here we are, we chose our governors already, we have our officer corps, which is what you want, now you move along. Kind of acá nada, keep moving. And it becomes a way of dealing with colonial power, subverting that colonial power, resisting that colonial power, and administering justice in those communities, continuing with traditional practices of punishing punishing criminals throughout not just the Spanish era, but into the Mexican and American period. There are examples at Isleta Pueblo in New Mexico, for example, where there's a murder in the community. and the murderer, they don't know who it is, but they find a body of somebody, and he's down by the river, and they kind of dredge out this corpse, and it's a dead community member. And American authorities would want whoever the murderer is to be punished, to be typically, you'd be executed. I mean, this is sort of late 19th century American West. It's the Wild West, frontier justice. Take them to an American court, have them punished severely, maybe executed. Well, what happens instead is the Isleta people, like basically the American authorities and others who try to come and question them about what's happened, they totally hide everything. They say, oh yeah, we don't know who it is, and the Americans are getting frustrated, like, tell us who the guilty party is, and they won't do it. And eventually, what they end up doing is they do it in a traditional indigenous way, which is, you might have heard the concept of like covering the dead or raising the dead. And so covering the dead is the idea, if you cause the death of somebody in a family, you pay a determined price, which then serves as restitution for that death. And it would be decided upon and agreed upon, and it might be several $100s, it might be goods, and that's what they do. And the American authorities are there, and they say, well, we should take the guilty party to court. And the Indians are like, nah, but we already took care of it, we're fine. And this one observer who's the Catholic priest there, who's actually a Belgian Catholic priest in New Mexico, the people in the community are like, see, that's the guilty guy right there. He's on a work detail with the community, like everyone knows who it is. And he's like, I can't understand why you wouldn't want justice dispensed. And they say, we have a system, we have ways of dealing with crime, with traditional laws, with governing our communities. And so, and there's many examples of that, of using this actual system to subvert colonial authority. And it's a way to exert their own power. It's a way to continue, and the term we would use is sovereignty. It's a way to maintain sovereignty. And what is sovereignty? Sovereignty is control of your own community and of your own land base, and maintaining that control. And that's what Indigenous people are doing throughout this period, as much as they can. Under certain circumstances, it's more constrained, and they're not able to do it as much as they probably would have liked. For example, talking about Yaquis, which is one of the groups. I mean, how many of you know that there's a Yaqui tribe in southern Arizona? Okay, some people don't. How many of you know that they're not from there? They're not from southern Arizona. They're not. That's not their indigenous homeland, although Edward Spicer might say something different and kind of use... Anyway, that's a whole other discussion. What happened was, during the 19th century, the Mexican government pursued a policy of extermination of Yaquis. Yaquis were like the Apaches of Sonora. They hated Yaquis. They were seen as violent and bloodthirsty, just like in the United States. Apaches are terrible. It's a funny story, when I was courting my future wife, my wife now, her grandma said, oh, but he's part Apache, they've got tempers and they're terrible. So the Mexican state felt the same way about Yaquis, and but pursued a policy of extermination and enslavement. So outright killing Yaqui people, or taking those men, women, children, and sending them to plantations in Yucatan, where they were enslaved and forced into these labor plantations where many of them died. And so Yaquis went to southern Arizona as refugees. That's how they ended up in Tucson at Barrio Libre and places like that, and now Pascua, which is one of the main Yaqui communities. They actually entered into the United States during the late 19th and early 20th century as political refugees. And as they come into the United States, they had that same system of town government with governors and people with staffs, but they're fearful of getting kicked out of the United States. And so to have overt displays of political power, to have overt, visible governments with people in power and exercising sovereignty in those communities, they feel like it will endanger their communities, and so they shouldn't do that. So what they do is they kind of go underground, and they shed those visual markers, and turn to the Catholic Church mainly for support there, and the Catholic priest at places like Guadalupe, which is in, now it's part of Phoenix area, helps them get a small parcel of land, and they sort of exist there on the fringes and try to sort of hide their identity. And many of them pass as ethnic Mexicans. And they say, well, we're Mexicans. Even in that time, and this is in Eric's book, it wasn't good to be a Mexican-American in Arizona in the 19th century. It's not like that was a great thing, because you would still be subjected to prejudice and oppression, but it was better than being an Indian. And so they sort of passed as ethnic Mexicans. They spoke Spanish because they came from Mexico. And they didn't exercise those same forms of governance, because to do so would have imperiled their community. So they sort of hide those things and go underground. And those systems of government still exist in the Sonora side. There's still governors and town governance in that model, but not in the Yaqui communities in Arizona. They have, I don't know what they have, a tribal chairman, and it's not the old Spanish system. But because that was a tactic of survival, of subverting and sort of keeping out of the eye of the colonial state. It's like the eye of the all-seeing eye of Sauron or whatever. It's like watching that community. We're going to kind of keep to ourselves and try to stay quiet. But throughout, these are examples of Native peoples either using or not using, but primarily using the tools of the oppressor to try to get around the oppressor, basically, to subvert the oppressor. It's using his tools and his models to survive and to continue as sovereign communities. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. And in the end, this isn't a story of, it's not a happy story. It's one of continued oppression that Indigenous people face from the Spanish period through the U.S. period. And for those of you who might think, the United States was better than Spain, I have news for you, that's not true. That's not true. Just as bad, or in many cases worse, depending on the context and the situation. Yeah.
All right, so I'm only going to ask a couple more questions, maybe two, and then we've already been going for 45 minutes. I want to give other people a chance to ask questions. But I do want to ask one thing. In your reply just now, you mentioned that Diego de Vargas, as he reconquers New Mexico, wrote a lot, right? And if you read your book, a lot of this stuff we're getting about how Indigenous communities functioned politically, right? How their politics function, their internal governance, is coming from Spanish observation, right? Yeah. The vast majority of Indigenous people during the period you are talking about did not read and write in Spanish, let alone in their own language. Told stories through oral history, maybe had the help of winter calendars and that sort of thing. But I guess my next question is, how do you get at, you're telling a story of Indigenous people making their own rules, adopting from the Spanish the tools that they can use to facilitate a higher degree of sovereignty. But you're telling it largely from Spanish sources.
Sure.
How do you deal with that issue in a book like this?
I mean, it's a fair critique. How do you reconstruct a story that in some ways is intact in Indigenous sources and oral histories? I mean, I use oral histories, I use accounts from Indigenous people, I use sort of anecdotal conversations with people from these groups, I use observation in those communities. I mean, when we went to Yaqui villages, I mean, I was keen on seeing who the governors were and who there they call it the guardia, which is, they're the only people in the villages that have guns. And you know who the officers are and who the people in power because they have these rifles. They're rusty, crummy, single-shot rifles.
22s or something.
Yeah, and they might not even have ammunition. Can you open the door? That's... Come on in. So it's using a variety of methods, but at the core for the colonial era, what do we have in terms of sources that we can actually get our hands on and look at? It's documents from the Spaniards. So it becomes a question of finding Indigenous voices. Where do you find those voices? You find them in petitions that are filed by Native peoples. They go to the alcalde of one area, or they go to the governor of New Mexico, and they file a petition. Sometimes they're literate, and sometimes those come from people in the communities who could write. But oftentimes, you have to find a Spaniard who will advocate for you, and maybe there's an issue of translation, and maybe they're not on the up and up completely, and so you have to account for those things. But in New Mexico, there was actually an office that was called the Protector de Indios, who was, his actual legal responsibility was to act as an advocate for Native people in New Mexico in court cases and to provide counsel and legal advice. And some protectors are remembered favorably by Native people. And oral tradition holds that certain Spanish officials were good and were helpful. And so in those cases, if the document comes from that period, you can sort of count on that it'll probably be true to life. It'll probably be a reliable source. But in other cases, you have to just kind of, it's a matter of pulling out threads and finding that one thread that is an indigenous voice and figuring out what it means. Like, for example, archives of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. And one of them related to, at Zuni, there was a man who got into trouble because he was going into church ceremonies, and he was sort of getting the people in the community riled up. And he was telling them, oh, there's an Apache attack that's imminent. Everybody get ready and leave the church. And so he's getting people out of there. And then he's kind of like, well, I'm the governor now. He kind of declares himself governor. And so what's going on there? I mean, there's what's on the surface, but then there's what's under the surface. And you have to pull out those threads. And you have to say, okay, this guy is obviously subverting the authority of the church, which is the face of Spanish colonial power. I mean, the priest is the person you interface with the most in a mission community. And so he's finding a way to oppose the power of the priest. Second of all, he's, by declaring himself some kind of leader in that community, maybe he's questioning the authority of those sitting officers. Maybe, we have tribal disputes, we have political, infighting. Maybe he's opposing their authority in that case. He also, the whole episode is kind of comical, and I use it in my book, but sort of, maybe at the same time, Native people have a sense of humor. Maybe he's in there and he's playing sort of an elaborate practical joke. And it works in some ways. And he gets the community riled up and everybody leaves. He also goes in there and puts on the vestments and says the mass himself. I just think this is a guy that's funny, more than anything. He's kind of flaunting colonial power and assuming all these things on his own. And so those are those little threads that you have to pull out of the documents. Some documents are more reliable than others. You have to kind of be able to assess that. You have to determine what can be used and what can't be used. But not all sources are created equally, and that's a thing as historians that we confront. Even indigenous sources. It's not like just because it came from an Indian, it's a good source. It's not always that way. And so you have to be able to decipher things. But the common term historically used by historians is sort of like upstreaming and being able to read against the current and finding the voices of people that have been silenced. It is a skill, and it's something you acquire through experience and through time. But that's what I did with these documents. And maybe in some cases I failed. Maybe there's some places where I didn't get it right. History isn't an exact science. I mean, Bill, you know that. It's a trial and error, and sometimes we learn the things that we thought were right weren't. And that's why you have second editions and revisions, right? And people talk like revisionist history is a bad thing. It's like, well, would you rather have bad history, or would you rather learn more and, oh gosh, there are things we didn't know that we can update and make a better history. But the goal is to get it as right as you can the first time, and that's what I try to do.
You pegged me. That's why I did the second edition. Don't read the first edition. It's all garbage. I have one more question.
Okay.
And that is, I know what questions you set out, why you took on this project in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
What did you find that surprised you the most in your research that you didn't expect? Did it change what you thought you would find?
Probably the most surprising finding had to do with, so I referenced the story at Fort McDowell where Frank Harrison and Harry Austin go to the county registrar and try to vote, and they then take him to court, and it's overturns the policy that barred Native people from voting. And so the idea that Native people would struggle for the vote You know, that there was even somebody wrote a master's thesis that was called the fight for Indian voting in New Mexico. The fight for Indian voting rights, right? That we're as ethnic minorities, we struggle against oppressive systems and finally win rights. And during the U.S. administration in this region, which goes from 1846 until the present, but during the territorial period, which is 1846 to 1912, it's the opposite. Native people fight for their right not to vote and not to be citizens. They don't want to do it. And it goes against the prevailing wisdom, which would be, but isn't the ultimate goal, the gold standard, is to be an American citizen, fully enfranchised. You know, we're celebrating the 100th year anniversary of women gaining the right to vote, right? This is 100 years since a constitutional amendment made it so that women could vote in the United States. And we like to see that kind of story because it has a happy ending. But probably the most surprising is both in Arizona and New Mexico, Native people are continually struggling not to. And you read it in the statements of the agents. There's the agent at San Javier del Bac, which is a Tohono O'odham reservation in southern Arizona, just outside Tucson, if you've been to the church there, you know, that beautiful mission church. First of all, they allot that community, which means they divide the land into plots that are given to individual heads of family. And if you have an allotment, you become a voting citizen. And so the Indian agent who is there is writing these reports every year after the allotment process. They've received parcels of land, they're enfranchised, they're citizens, they should be voting, and there's a several year span in the 1890s, early 1900s, where this Indian agent writes these reports and he talks about the conditions in the community, and these people have taken up farming, and we have an agency farmer who's showing them how to farm, even though these people know how to farm for forever. It's like, okay, they didn't need some American showing them how to farm. But anyway, he's writing these reports. He's saying like, oh, and most of them are wearing citizen dress, is how they refer to it. Trousers and a shirt for men, women with a dress covering their bodies, right? And he's all of these things that he's trying to say, like, our work is going well. But then at the very end, there's almost this little aside where he says, but to date, no one has either leased land or taken up the vote. I'm confident that next year they will. Next year's report comes in. Once again, nobody has gone to the polls and voted. And so the question, well, why aren't they voting? And it's because in these communities, and the guiding principle is we will do enough to satisfy you so that you'll leave us alone. And we won't go beyond that. And so in these communities, they've done just up to this point of what was required, but the idea in that community, in Pueblo communities in New Mexico, and Yaqui communities as well, is we're not going to go beyond that, because to do so then opens us up to more of your influence, and we don't want that in our communities. We want to maintain, distinctive, ethnically kind of heterogeneous in a way, or homogeneous communities that can provide a united front against further influence and further land theft and incursions. And so it's really, instead of framing it as the right or the fight for the Indian vote in New Mexico and Arizona, it's the fight against the Indian vote in New Mexico and Arizona during the late 19th century and early 20th century. And that was kind of one of the most surprising things for me.
Yeah. Me too, by the way. I mean, that's the aspect, I think, of your story that has got to still have resonance for Native communities today, is what degree to participate in the political process. And at what level? Which political process?
Well, and it's even an important contemporary issue, because policymakers and politicians frequently lament that voting levels are low in Native American communities. And the question is, well, how do we get more Native people to go to the polls and vote? And the answer that I often give is, historically, not showing up to the polls was a method of voting. It was disapproval. So by not going, you were saying, I don't approve of this, and so I'm not going to go, and that's how I vote. And there are examples where the U.S. government uses that and flips it around and says, well, all those people who didn't vote, like for the Indian Reorganization Act, for example. Initially, Collier said, not going to the polls is a vote for the Indian Reorganization Act. He didn't understand that fundamentally not going to the polls was a way of voting against it.
Right.
And so that it has resonance today in Indigenous communities. Why aren't people voting? Because they don't trust that system. Why would they? You know, it hadn't served them well for 300 years. Why all of a sudden, oh yeah, I'm gonna rock the vote, it's great. So
By the way, I do notice that you are dressed as a citizen with your.
I am, I have
You got
trousers
jacket,
and a
but-
shirt, yeah.
But the bolo belt gives it away.
I have my gone.
You are still resisting. I call it a bolo belt. I actually don't know what it's called. What do you call it?
Just a beaded belt buckle.
Okay. That's what it is. All right, I'm going to let you guys ask questions now. Does anyone want to ask questions? Yeah.
What changed in the early 20th century that made some people want to vote?
A variety of things. So the United States pursues a policy of assimilation that takes children out of communities and educates them in boarding schools, in civics, in American government. And some of those, I mean, when you're a child, imagine that, you're 5 years old and you're sent to a boarding school where it's hammered into you about American politics. And in those days, you know, people say, we don't teach civics anymore. Well, these boarding schools taught civics. They forced these ideas on the Native people and pounded them into their heads. And so some of these students return home, and they're the rising generation of leaders. They've internalized ideas of American politics and civics. And so you have some groups of individuals who are boarding school educated, who the government then decides, oh, we're going to work with these guys because they're friendly to us. And this is the classic hostiles, friendlies splits in these communities. It happens at Hopi, at a place like Oribe, where you have a split between, you know, traditionalists and those who are more accommodating to the federal government. And what do? They have a giant pushing war where there's a lot about it. You can look at it. I won't tell the whole story here, but and so that's one thing that changes. You have community members who have been inculcated with ideas of American civics and political participation that makes them more amenable to the federal government and to federal forms and ideas of citizenship. You also have allotment of land in severalty, and it wasn't very common in Arizona. I mean, our tribe wasn't allotted, but Salt River was allotted. Tohono-O'odham, not the big reservation, not the Sells Res, but the San Javier del Bac reservation is allotted. Hopi, they try allotment there. They do some allotment in a few of those communities, but it sort of doesn't work. But in some of those places, if you took an allotment, you became a citizen. And so that, you know, changes some of this. But what I would say really changes the desire of Native people to be involved in American politics is World Wars I and II. That's what changes everything, because you have a generation of Native people who go off and see the world and are exposed to different things, and who are serving in integrated units. They're not in segregated units like African Americans are, and so soldiers are serving alongside Italian Americans, white Anglo Americans. They're all in a group together, and they have these wartime experiences where they're part of. I mean, you have to view the army or the military as part of the federal machinery. It is. It's a representative of the federal government in a world of war. They come back to their communities, and a lot of Native veterans reflected on the fact that when they went to France or Germany or Japan or other places, they were on occupation forces or they were fighting overseas, that they were actually treated well by Europeans, for example. Europeans love Indians. They still do. You know, I went to a conference and this guy, you know, found out I was Apache, he shook my hand and said, oh, he's an Irish historian, a university professor, and he said, my father would be rolling in his grave to know I'd shook the hand of a real live Apache. And so those types of experiences where Native peoples are, you know, they're fetishized and exoticized, but they're treated well. And oh, let me buy you a drink, let me feed you, you know, you're a real American Indian. And this type of treatment, when they go back to their communities and they see the poverty and they see the lack of civil rights, then they start to think, okay, well maybe enfranchisement, citizenship, voting will alleviate some of those issues that we're facing. But that's really it's a post-World War I to some extent, and really post-World War II experience in the United States.
Something else happens between those two wars, and that's the Indian Reorganization Act.
IRA in the 1930s, yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
with the end of allotment, with the notion that indigenous communities should have the right to form their own governments, do you think that
Yeah.
has anything to do with it?
I think it does to some extent, but I mean, those IRA is really problematic as well.
Sure.
Because it's the idea of, oh, we're going to grant you this right of self-rule. A lot of these communities are like, we already have councils and we already have governments. What do you mean you're going to grant us this right? It's the idea that colonial states grant rights to Native people. Rights are inherent. Rights are inherent. Sovereign rights of indigenous communities are inherent. And that's a thing that I also underscores my book. It's that sovereignty is inherent. It's not granted. Colonial nation states cannot grant the power to govern to Native communities. They have those powers by virtue of being indigenous nations and peoples.
By the way, really nice Irish accent. I mean, and maybe you stereotyped my people a little bit, but
I've never been.
anyway, yeah.
Dr. Crandall, why would the Yaqui appropriate a Mexican identity if not to have a pathway to citizenship?
So that's an interesting question, and the existing documentation for Tucson area or for Guadalupe. So the primary Yaqui communities are Guadalupe outside Tempe, and Barrio Libre, Old Pascua, and then later New Pascua. So those are the primary Yaqui communities in southern Arizona. What we have from the 1930s and from when Ned Spicer really becomes involved in those communities, and Ned Spicer is seen as for many Yaquis as sort of like a hero in a way. I mean, he helps them gain federal recognition in the 1970s. So he's in those communities documenting lifeways, but he says very emphatically, Yaquis are not seeking citizenship. They're not seeking the rights of citizenship, because I mean the experience under Mexico during the 18th century, 19th century, early 20th century. I mean, Yaquis are involved in the Mexican Revolution, and they're fighting for different people. I mean, they're marshaled by different leaders. In the north in Sonora is really the heart of the Mexican Revolution. With Diaz and Carranza and all these, all these disputes going on. Yaqui peoples are sort of sucked into that sphere as well. And I think that experience is so traumatic. And the Yaqui kind of tradition of just trying to avoid detection, which really is ever present in the 19th century into the 20th, I think that carries over into the United States. And I'm not trying to say that there's a pathology or anything, but there's an idea that we band together as people, we look out for one another, but the way that we're going to see to the good of our community is through migrant labor, through engaging in mining work, canal building, railroad construction, farm labor, and we're going to become economically viable, and that money will help our communities be solvent. We're going to turn to the Catholic Church, but we're not going to turn to government entities to seek that kind of protection, because what happened in Mexico and Spain before that was terrible. I mean, it was really, really bad. Yaquis being hunted down for decades at a time, and sort of a continual state of war. And so I think that you can't imagine that people who have lived through that experience will then suddenly come to the United States and say, oh, we're good here. This is the land of the free and the home of the brave. So they sort of try to hide their identity as Indians, because being Indian in Mexico had resulted in death in many circumstances, and instead sort of try to assume a Mexican identity on the surface to avoid detection. And Yaquis for a long time thought they were going to be deported. Many thought that they would be deported again, and so they sort of went underground because of that. And then word came that they weren't going to be deported. And then you have a progression of those communities becoming more rooted in southern Arizona, and eventually it leads to federal recognition as a tribe.
Ma'am, you had a question a while ago?
Oh, yeah, you had
I think
a-
your
oh,
hand was
yeah.
up.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
You mentioned, I think it's Leto, but it's Pueblo in general, and maybe, and some other tribes are matrilineal, matrilocal. So are the,
So not all the Pueblos, not all the
Not all.
Pueblos. I was referring
Can you
to
repeat the
Apaches, and she was talking about tribal units being matrilineal or matriarchal, and it depends on the community, and not all the Pueblos are matrilineal. Some are, but some aren't. I was referring to Apaches and Yavapai.
so is there, you mentioned governors and the whole thing about, it all seems rather,
male-centered.
male-centered,
Oh, yeah,
yes. So
yeah.
can you point a historian that talks about similar histories from a feminine point of view,
Mhm.
that, you know, I could read that?
Yeah. There's a book by Kathy Brown, I believe is her name, that's called Pueblo Indians and Spanish Colonial Authority, and it really talks about how gender roles are altered through the Spanish colonial experience. One of the problems with this is like, Pueblo people are not, you can't just go there and say like, hey, tell me about your culture, your gender roles. I mean, these are communities that sort of have survived through being in some ways closed off to outsiders, or only as accommodating as they feel like being, and so out of respect, I mean, there were things in my research and my writing that I just didn't touch. I didn't touch the ceremonial. I didn't look at the esoteric or the religious. I mean, those are the community. I only looked at what was outward, and secular governments are outward facing naturally, and so those are the things that I looked at. But in terms of looking at issues of clan and sacred sites and ceremonies and all those things, those belong in those communities. Those aren't my business to touch.
I might mention to you, there's a book by Virginia Bouvier, I don't know how she pronounces it. It's like Colbert and Colbert. Anyway, on California missions,
Yeah.
that's quite good. It's called Codes of Silence.
Juliana Barr.
And Juliana Barr's work on Texas called Peace Came in the Form of a Woman, that deal with pretty deeply with questions of gender.
Juliana Barr's book is very good. It looks at primarily Caddo peoples in southern Texas, and how gender becomes a way to relate to Spaniards, and symbols of Catholicism are sort of misunderstood but also appropriated to use as symbols of peace. For example, the Virgin of Guadalupe. When Spanish colonizers enter Caddo villages, the lack of women usually signified that it was a war party, like look out. And so when the Spaniards come and they say, we want to interact with you and establish relationships, and Caddo peoples are like, well, where are your women? Because that would be a symbol of peace. And so when they see the Virgen of Guadalupe on flags, then they sort of look at that and say, okay, maybe that is a symbol of your peaceful intention. And so Peace Came in the Form of a Woman becomes the title of the book. But it's a very good book.
You know, I just came back from 2 weeks in Mexico and saw lots of visions of
Oh, yeah.
Guadalupe down
Yes.
there.
Yeah. Well, and then the Virgen, it becomes even an indigenous Mary, right? And who does she appear to? Juan Diego, an indigenous man. So yeah, it's indigenized.
So right next to you, you had a question?
Yes, I have a question on the tribes that live on the border, the U.S.-Mexico border.
Uh-huh.
On the U.S. side, there's a reservation designated area. I assume.
Yeah.
Is there a similar one on the Mexico side?
Yeah, so that's complicated. Mexico does not have reservations in the way that we would envision them. They have, some groups have been granted status of zona indígena, so an indigenous zone. Yaquis are part of an indigenous zone where sovereignty, kind of self-government is allowed. Famously, if you go into the Yaqui territory, they make their own license plates, but they're often just hand-painted. It's the Yaqui flag. and they put them on there. And the Mexican state police or the other, outside policing authorities won't stop you. I mean, they realize that, and so you don't have to go and buy a license. I wish that I could just paint the Yaquis license plate, it's like, but, so there are zona indígenas, there are indigenous ejidos, which are common lands, but the Mexican government really sought to divest indigenous people of communal landholding practices in a very concentrated way. And Eric has actually written knows a lot about this.
So, but the people on those reservations, so half of them are U.S. citizens, the other half are Mexican citizens?
They are dual citizens on the southern side. And they go into the United States for services. Like if you needed to go to Indian Health Services, Tana Ottoms that are on the Mexican side would go onto the U.S. side and go to an IHS facility there. So it's a complicated concept of dual citizenship that occurs there. Actually, it's like tri-citizenship, right? Because
Well,
it's Mexican, U.S., and tribal citizenship, all kind of in conflict with one another.
There are many Sonoran O'odham who can't get that citizenship.
Yeah, yep.
And with increasing border enforcement, are having a harder and harder time crossing back and forth.
There are those there's a question of where exactly they were born.
Right.
And so I was born in this village that's on this side, and then they say, no, actually you weren't, and we think you were born on the Mexican side. And so people who had gone their entire lives thinking they were American citizens, who served in the military and, kind of had this conception of themselves and their identity. What's the book called, the famous book? That has a bunch of oral histories of Tana Ottoms and this exact question of...
We are a nation, something.
Yeah.
I'll remember it before we're done. Yeah. You had a question.
When you were talking about in the 19th, early 20th century, that rejection of citizenship, how much of that was a matter of wanting to maintain that autonomy, maintain their own culture, and how much of that was a matter of learning from experience that the American government had this long history of granting citizenship, so it was easier to take it away?
So the question is, how much of a rejection of American citizenship in the late 19th and early 20th century is based on wanting to maintain community solvency, sort of, status as sovereign communities, and how much of it was knowledge, perhaps, that the United States federal government can be fickle with citizenship and sort of grant and take away. I don't think that indigenous people had that conception of the federal government at that time, because a lack of experience, maybe, they don't quite know what they're dealing with yet. What's interesting is in New Mexico, the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, this guy's name is James Calhoun, no relation to John C., but he's another Calhoun. He's there in the 1840s and early 1850s, after the war with Mexico, that the U.S. basically conquers all of where we are today. Indigenous leaders carrying canes go and meet with American officials, like James Calhoun. And they say, these are our symbols of power, these are what Spain recognized and Mexico recognized, and this is who we are. And they're going as sovereigns. And the issue in New Mexico, and Arizona to some extent as well, becomes, over the ensuing decades, these people don't exactly fit into an existing model. They don't fit into our pre-existing conceptions of indigenous peoples and what their communities should look like. And so the closest thing we can think of is, in order to protect your communities, we are going to, James Calhoun says, we're going to designate you as wards of the federal government, like other indigenous nations are at that time. And you can have the protections of, there's a series of acts called the Non-Intercourse Acts that regulate relationships between tribes and the federal government. Because the idea was, if you were brought in as wards and have the protection of these federal acts, you can maintain your traditional forms of governance, because the main thing that Non-Intercourse Acts do is they keep outsiders from moving onto tribal land. And so you can keep your customs, and they say your ancient customs, which are a combination of ancient custom and Spanish governance as well. But it's very funny, Calhoun says, in order for that to happen, you can't vote. You can't vote. Because the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had designated anyone that had been a Mexican citizen would become an American citizen. And Mexico had declared all Indians citizens. It didn't matter if you were a mission-dwelling Indian or any Indian was a citizen under Mexico. And so then the issue becomes, well, does that make all of the Indians in New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Utah, Colorado, California, American citizens right away? Because if they become American citizens, then protected land, reservations don't exist. If you're an American citizen, how can you have trust land with federal oversight? And so the idea becomes, assume this designation of ward, not because you're a child and should be a ward of the government in that sense, but because this is the way to protect communities and to protect community land. And for their part, those communities, they send petitions to the federal government, and you can read them. They're in the files in Washington and elsewhere that say, we've been told our options and we will not vote and we don't want to be citizens. We want to maintain our status as indigenous communities.
In answer to your question real quick, it's called It's Not Our Fault.
It's not our fault,
Yes.
yeah.
The long title is The Case for Amending Present Nationality to Law to Make All Members of the Tohono O'odham Nation United States citizens now and forever.
Yeah.
So
It's a hard to get book though. It's not one that's like
Yes.
in every library. You have to, but it's worth a read. I mean, you could get it on loan.
I don't have it on my shelf or anything in my office,
No.
so don't ask. All right. Question in the back?
Yeah, why did New Spain take such a different approach in New Mexico, Arizona versus California?
That's a good question.
Yeah. So, in terms of governance, it wasn't a very different approach. The mission communities in California had these structures as well. There have been a number of studies on it, like Hackle, what's the book? Children of Coyote, Missionaries of St. Francis, which talks about this form is there. It's a little bit different because it's a different context, but the form of government is there. Where they differ is the California, I would say, I'm kind of hesitant to say this, but like the level, I think, of violence in California is demonstrably higher. And I don't know what the exact answer is, but from Spanish mission times with, Junipero Serra, who is, a cult hero at one point and now is decried as a genocidal maniac. Our conceptions of him have changed over time. But the level of violence at those missions seems to be higher. Let's say that. I don't think that you could say in the missions in New Mexico, the violence wasn't there, or in Arizona. The violence is there. Violence is always there. Because how do you get people to live in a walled community and stay there? You do it through coercive measures. And they may take different forms, but it seems like the California mission experience results in a more complete genocide, really, and it's pretty accepted now. Scholars refer to what's happened in California as genocide. I mean, that's the term that's used. The California Indians experienced genocide on a massive scale. It's continued into the American period. So when the 49ers go to California, what's left of the indigenous population, then you have bounties and just open killings of native peoples, posses of militia that go out and kill every Indian that they can find. So that you have, has anyone read Ishi, the last of the Yaquis? Why is he hiding out in the hills in 19 whatever? Because his people had been hunted well up to that point, and he's fearful of his life because of this history of genocide in California.
Could I add something to that, though?
Yeah.
And it's sort of in your book. It's in the nature of who you focused on. You focused on Pueblos, Tohono O'odham, Yaquis, Hopis, all groups that were sedentary or semi-sedentary horticulturalists, right? by the 19th century,
Yeah.
by the late 18th century, when California is finally colonized, it's the last part of the U.S. Southwest to be colonized. The main groups in power throughout the borderlands were Utes, Navajos, Apaches, Comanches, Wichitas, Yavapais. And California was different because you still had a relatively sedentary population, even without being farmers. It's an interesting group of cultures, actually. And
A sedentary kind of gathering culture.
exactly.
Yeah.
And missions had always sort of been used primarily, effectively, for already sedentary or partly sedentary groups.
Mhm.
And so I think the exception of California, when all the other missions are being shut down, and they're starting to turn towards military forts and peace treaties, trying to deal diplomatically, trying to trade, the missions in California are an exception.
Yeah.
Because the Spaniards, certain Spanish officials say, we think this will work best here, in essence.
Yeah, yeah.
That would be
when,
my,
when the other missions have long since secularized or
Yeah,
closed down.
exactly.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Wait, one more question, because it's 6 o'clock, so.
I'd like to add a postscript to this.
Yeah.
Kind of, the Yavapai Apache people, you know, before all this time you're talking about our tribals, but we're not missionized. And in 1934, we accept, I mean, we're made wards of the state, we finally get a reservation, and we accept the 1934 Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
So we start working,
An IRA constitution.
right,
Mhm.
on democracy.
Mhm.
And as you mentioned, World War I, World War II, my father and that group, that
Group of
generation.
post-war leaders.
Yes,
Yeah.
come back and you have what you have described. Now go to 2020. And because of all of this, first of all, as you mentioned, we're not really great at democracy yet. We have a different form. We've always lived that way. And to this day, we still don't do real well with democracy, even though we've had a constitution since 1934.
How would you know? No, I'm just kidding.
So what I want to say with postscript to add to what you say is, you have a group of people now who have been Americanized and democratized, who are now looking towards trying to maintain their culture.
Yeah.
And it is a spiritual way of looking at Indianness, as opposed to what we've been living for the last 100 years under the rule of the United States government. So to this day, we talk about our sovereignty. And yes, we're wards, we have a reservation, but we do, and there are a lot of people who feel this way, as much as we can to keep an arm's length.
Yeah.
Because the more that we become part of that society, the more we lose our culture, and the more we become not Indians. And during the time that I was chair, I said, what makes us different? We live in the same houses, we wear the same clothes,
Citizen
we
dress.
drive the same cars, we eat the same food. So what makes us different?
Fry bread?
Our culture.
Yeah.
Our culture. And we fight for our culture by keeping an arm's length.
Exactly.
Because when we lose our culture, we're nothing.
We're not.
I mean, our language is a big part of it, but the spiritual aspect of it, we want to stay Yavapais and Apaches. And in order to do that, we can't be like everybody else because we are different, and we always have been.
We'll take one more question, even though we're past due. And I do want to say, I know that if technically this ends at 6. If people have to be somewhere, it's not rude to get up and go where you need to go.
They
Go
told
ahead.
us we could stay though, and we'll just go out these doors.
How
Yeah.
does intermarriage impact Native American people? And is it different from tribe or nation to nation, tribe to tribe,
Yeah.
as far as what percentage to be a member of the tribe?
I mean, this is a whole different discussion. Yeah, it's going to differ from one community to the next. And the era that I'm looking at, colonial through early 20th century, rates of intermarriage are still relatively low. Yeah, I mean, it's really the 20th century where you see, and latter 19th century, but where you see rising rates of intermarriage, and the federal government is all in favor of that, because through a policy of like blood quantum, for example, requiring a certain amount of indigenous blood in order to be a tribal member is a way of excluding people eventually, right? And so, thanks for coming. So, you get them below that bar, and then they're no longer Indians, right? And we don't have to think of them as...
So does it vary from tribe to tribe?
Yeah, I mean, the requirements vary from one to the next, sure. Thank you all for coming.